We're going to talk about pieces of ours which are being performed by the orchestra next year. Linda said they were new pieces. I mean, they're newer than Rachmaninoff. But actually, technically speaking, neither of them is brand new. My piece was actually written 10 years ago for the orchestra for its 75th birthday. And they're bringing it out again for their 85th birthday. Brett, your piece is what, about 5 years old?
My piece is 5 years old. So by the time, it'll be late next year, so it'll be 6 years old, which is still relatively new.
Has it been played in Sydney before?
It's not been played as a concert piece, but it has been heard in Sydney as part of a ballet, and I'll talk a little bit about that.
Well, maybe we should talk. One of the things that you've been talking about, I know, is structure. And maybe we should talk about structure as far as our pieces are concerned, because I think we probably both take rather different approaches to Sergei Rachmaninoff.
Yeah, and also, I mean, we're in the symphony bracket, but I don't think either of us would refer to our pieces as symphonies, but they're written for symphony orchestra, and I guess, well, I don't know your piece in this instance, although I've conducted your symphony, which was a symphony.
Which was a symphony.
My piece, Fire Music, I guess has sort of, symphonic elements to it, whatever that might mean
and it's
nowadays.
Big. It's big
and
like
it's
a
big.
symphony.
Yeah, it's sort of, symphony kind of implies a little, a larger space of time apart from anything else. And I guess it's a similar length then to Rachmaninoff's third, or a bit shorter. But talking about the form, in this instance, although some of my pieces do follow conventional formal patterns or shapes, Fire Music's, the form of it, just trying to think about it, it's hard to say. It's quite episodic, and if anything, the overriding thing that determines elements of its form is its orchestration. Partly also because I use satellite groups, 3 different satellite groups that come into play in different places in the piece. And that sort of gives a new element, and with it a kind of a new formal section of the piece, which is something I hadn't really tried before. So it doesn't fit into a kind of sonata form structure, but it does have elements of things certainly coming back in a.
What about maybe we should talk about the title, because obviously you don't call the piece Fire Music for no reason at all, and there's a story behind this piece, which I imagine also affects the structure.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's called Fire Music, and it is actually written in memory of the victims of the Black Saturday fires in Victoria in 2009. And whilst thankfully, I wasn't personally affected by the fires, I was in Melbourne on the day that they happened, and significantly also the days prior to the fires, which were horrendously hot. I mean, a kind of heat that I've never, rarely experienced before. And then a couple of months later, the following Easter, visited the property of friends of ours that was in a fire-affected zone. They themselves survived. A lot of their neighbours didn't. We spoke with a friend of theirs who had lost everything, but thankfully not his family members, but his possessions were all gone. And he'd lost a lot of friends and so on. And we walked through the charred remains of much of that property. And at that stage, it was one of the first weekends that large areas of that whole Healesville and so on area were open for the first time since the fires to general motorists and visitors and so on. And there were still charred out remnants of cars on the side of the road, and walking through so much ash and burnt out remnants of forest, I was also struck by these little green shoots everywhere. And so that sort of really affected me quite profoundly, this sense of, this new life coming out of just such horror, that then fed into this piece, or at least that was the point where I realised I wanted to actually explore it in sound somehow.
The idea of sort of new growth is very potent, isn't it, musically? And it sort of suggests a kind of organic approach to form. Were you essentially following your nose when you wrote this piece?
There was this piece is kind of, because I didn't have an overriding formal structure to start with, it was very much sort of, I wonder where this path might lead. And I mentioned also this idea of different satellite groups or separate groups of musicians that are taken out of the orchestra and placed in the hall. And that was an idea that grew out of something of those thoughts. And sort of won more and more certain sort of fascination in my inner ear, I guess. I was then sort of captivated by the possibilities, the theatrical possibilities as well. And there comes into play the idea that this commission came about as being a piece for concert orchestra in a concert hall, and at the same time a dance piece, which I mentioned earlier. So it was, I had two commissions come in at the same time, and basically they were both such nice commissions. I wanted to do them both, but the only way I could fit it into my schedule was to somehow make it the same piece. The one commission was for an orchestral piece, which was initiated by the Royal Stockholm Philharmonic in Sweden, and a couple of other orchestras. And the other was to write a piece for the Australian Ballet as part of their 50th anniversary celebrations in 2012. Music for a new ballet by Graham Murphy, which was also, as you can imagine, for a composer, a nice and exciting prospect. So I then put it to them that, would it be possible for it to be both? Do you have a problem with that, the commissioning parties? And they were all quite open to that idea, and thankfully also, as was I, intrigued by the idea of writing a piece that's meant for a straight concert situation and a theatrical one. And I'd just come out of my experience of having just written my first opera, which had premiered here in Sydney in March of 2010. And that was a sort of turning point for me as a composer in many ways, simply because it was also the first time I'd ever sat in on the production of an opera from day one until opening night and beyond, and seen how a music theatre piece evolves. But above all, also that very particular excitement of being in a theatrical space rather than just a concert hall. I mean, I love concert halls. They're fabulous spaces too, and they often sound really good and so on. But what they don't necessarily have is that particular atmosphere of a black box theatre like this one too, where the lights go down and what happens then. And so that also kind of informed a lot of the decisions I made, that I realised I wanted the piece to also be specifically theatrical. So I'll play a bit later on of the very opening, which is somehow, came to me through that sense of darkness and of the theatre, but also the impending horror, if you like, or certainly drama of what was unfolding, certainly on that day in February of 2009. And so it sort of took on those aspects too. It's a really theatrical piece.
When I heard the piece for the first time, I've never actually been at a performance, I've only heard recording, but it seemed to me that that those groups of instruments that are not on stage, that are out there in the audience, there was I had a very specific image in mind, which is the spot fire, the way that a bushfire can throw out a sort of like a little bomb which explodes a kilometre away and starts another fire. I mean,
Yeah.
It felt like that, the way that the music spread through the hall.
Yeah, well, I also had this fascinating opportunity to talk with a CSIRO scientist who, it turns out, is also friends of the family. And he'd done a whole lot of research as to how those sorts of things happen in fires, in controlled circumstances, of course. But so that was also fascinating. Ultimately, and I was looking at that time of sort of having a kind of very scientific approach to how the piece might unfold, which I then abandoned after a while because the piece was becoming so instinctive. But it was fascinating to kind of come to terms with those thoughts, and then also some of the descriptions of the fires themselves were just so unbelievably gripping and horrifying, these massive walls of flame and so on, that, I realised there was an enormous and very primal thing going on there. I mean, I could play perhaps then a little bit of the opening. And this is something of, so if we take it from about 120, and fade in. This is the very opening, which has a lot of electronic sounds, and only bits of the orchestra start coming in. And eventually we are hurtled into quite a dramatic orchestral texture in which we start hearing these other groups. And just to point out that the groups consist of two trios of a flute, trumpet and percussion that are antiphonally placed in the theatre, and then a distant string quartet. And you could turn it up nice and loud too, I reckon. Well, it does get very loud later.
openings. You've written a lot of pieces that start from almost nothing and sort of insinuate themselves in the listener's mind, and then grow and grow and grow. My pieces tend to start with a bang.
Well, that's the other approach too. And I was always struck by something that, because in the time that I was starting to get into composing more seriously, I was still a member of the orchestra in Germany at the time. And so I was sort of finding my way. And in that time in Berlin, the composer in residence with the Berlin Philharmonic was Wolfgang Riem. And I showed him a couple of pieces, and he was one of the first sort of composers that I dared to show my music to. And I remember him saying to me, "Well, remember that all music is theatre. The mere act of making music is in itself a theatrical one. It's not normal conversation. It's something else." And his music is also incredibly theatrical in everything he does, whatever. And he writes in all sorts of different directions and genres, but it always has a great sort of sense of the theatre.
How much of a piece like Fire Music would you have sketched out? I'm talking about the big bones of it, or did you at least have in your mind before you started it?
Yeah, as I say, this piece sort of evolved in a much less planned way than a lot of my pieces do. And that was a bit unwieldy and scary at times. And normally I like to have a little more in place. But look, there's something, as Bernstein said, there's something about having a good idea and not enough time. I was also battling a deadline, so I just had to keep it moving. And that wasn't easy because, as I say, and perhaps you're the same, I mean, how much do you sketch beforehand, and how much changes as it unfolds?
Yeah, it varies, doesn't it, from piece to piece?
Yeah.
I like to have some notion of where I'm going. Otherwise, it's a bit like getting in the car and just driving.
Yeah.
And,
but then sometimes on those drives, interesting things happen.
Oh, yes. It doesn't mean you've got to go where you thought you were going.
Exactly.
But when you set out, at least you've got to think you know where you're going, and then you might think, oh, it looks pretty over there. I'll go that way.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go and check that out.
Yeah.
Well, it happened a bit like that. And then the other sort of big instrumental aspect to the piece that ended up being a kind of structural signpost or section of the piece, and so added to its formal, whatever it is formally, was the inclusion of an electric guitar. And so I really wanted to use that sound, partly because something about an electric guitar can give you a sense of heat haze like nothing else I know in orchestral music, certainly. And so there's this big, quite sort of monolithic moment for electric guitar, which we might just get a little bit of at the moment, which is the second cue. And just before we start, it then leads into the antiphonal use of these flutes that then bring into the piece something of its ritualistic aspect. Because I was then fascinated by this idea of rebirth, it's the idea of fire as ritual, as certainly in Indigenous Australia, a sense of cleansing and of celebration and so on. Those thoughts came into the piece. And so you'll hear this sort of chorus of distant flutes after a while, which is something of maybe a smoking ceremony, if you like. So at 10:25 or thereabouts. Carl earlier spoke about having been a performing musician with a group, and that group was Flederman. And I went to the Queensland Conservatorium in what is still referred to as the Flederman years. They were extraordinary years because these guys were playing great bits of new music from all around the world, just about every week. The flute player was Geoffrey Collins, and that's Geoffrey Collins playing there, the most beautiful flute playing. That's the Adelaide Symphony, where he's now principal flute. And so it was lovely to hear Carl make mention of that, because it was an incredibly inspiring time. Seeing, also he mentioned the trombonist, of course, Simon de Haan, seeing live performances of Cage and Stockhausen and Carter and Boulez, and and it was all still pretty new then too. This is in the late 70s, early 80s. It was a very formative experience, I must say. So it was great to also, get to work on that piece with such a great flute player.
Yes, and people you've admired as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I might ask you about this before I do, is the idea of pacing your music, of timing the events, because I think this is something which is one of the hardest things for a composer to do. I mean, it's something I find still I have to wrestle with quite a lot, and I think probably for young composers or inexperienced composers, it's also really hard. How long do you let something go on for? When is it going to become boring? And alternatively, when is it going to be not enough when you move on too soon?
And how do those perceptions of time also change over time with a generation that is growing up in a very, sort of Spotify kind of,
oh yeah.
I've had 3 minutes of that, that's enough, I'll move on to the next thing, that sort of thing. Although,
yes, I suppose that's true. But I always feel, the analogy I always use, and I'm sorry if you've heard me say this before, is that timing in a piece of music is not unlike timing when you tell a joke. And there are people who can tell jokes, and there are people who can't tell jokes.
Yeah.
And it's not because they forget the punchline. and they might use exactly the same words, but one of them's got good timing and they're funny, and the other one screws it up, and you don't really laugh. And I think it's awfully similar in music. If you don't get the timing right, you can have a tremendously good idea. You know, all of the notes might be right, but if something should really have gone on for another 2 beats, it's not going to be as effective as it would have been if you'd got the timing right.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, that, and I
What do you do?
battle with
how
it
do you,
as well.
Because I'll tell you what I do, and I got this from Ligeti. I saw a documentary about Ligeti many years ago, and he got out his stopwatch. And you might assume, if you know the music of the composer Ligeti, if you've ever looked at one of his scores, you might think that there was a lot of calculation in it, and in fact there isn't. What he did was he had this particular sound going on in his head, and he would click the stopwatch and he'd pace around the room, listening to the sound in his head, and then when it felt like exactly the right time to move, he'd hit the stopwatch, and he'd know that he'd need 2 minutes and 19 seconds of that.
Of that stuff.
Yeah, of that stuff.
Yeah,
and that's really not a bad way to work.
Yeah. Well, look, I must say, I think perhaps the thing that I really sort of gleaned from playing in an orchestra for many, many years, and a really good orchestra at that, was observing from a physical point of view as a player the architecture of large-scale works, and sort of just feeling in your muscles, in your muscle memory, in your physical being, how music works. I mean, playing in the Berlin Philharmonic was inspiring on many levels, but also very much on the physical level. It was a visceral experience, particularly in the viola section, which, I loved sitting down the back, because you're right in front of the best bass section in the world that has this, incredibly physical presence. And so you've sort of, I don't know, I got into feeling the music, and that sounds quite sort of simplistic, but it really, a Bruckner symphony was also just a kind of physical experience. Sometimes very exhausting too, because a lot of tremolo and stuff. And so I don't overdo the tremolo as a result. But it sort of taught me a lot about the arches of architecture in music, which again I think is an instinctive thing. But I also, I'm very fond of this quote of Ravel, who talked of composing being the knack of doing the right thing at the right time. And often, as you say, it might just be a matter of a couple of bars too many or too few that can really upset the balance or just chime it in right. Yeah, yes. There's no hard and fast rule.
No, but I think for young composers, it's important that you are not afraid of boring people, because on the whole, the tendency is not to let things go on long enough.